For over 2 decades, wealthy families across the Pacific Northwest had trusted the Riverside Orphanage as the premier source for adopting healthy, well-behaved children. The orphanage's reputation was sterling. They claimed a 100% success rate in placing children with loving families, and their adoption fees reflected their exclusive clientele. But in 1913, when several prominent families began asking questions about the children they had supposedly adopted years earlier, investigators made a horrifying discovery. Not a single child had ever actually been adopted from the Riverside Orphanage. The adoption certificates were forgeries, the reference letters were fabricated, and the children that families thought they were saving had disappeared without a trace. The Pacific Northwest of the 1890s was experiencing unprecedented growth as railroad connections brought waves of settlers seeking opportunity in the timber and fishing industries. Towns like Riverside, Oregon, had grown from frontier outposts to prosperous communities within a single generation, creating a new class of wealthy merchants and industrialists who possessed both the resources and the social conscience to engage in charitable work. The care of orphaned children had become a particular concern for these families, who viewed adoption not just as personal fulfillment, but as civic responsibility. Helena Cross arrived in Riverside in the spring of 1889 with impeccable credentials and a compelling personal story. A widow in her mid-30s, she claimed to have operated successful orphanages in both San Francisco and Portland before seeking a new location where she could implement innovative approaches to child welfare. Her letters of recommendation came from prominent religious leaders and social reform advocates throughout California and Oregon, all praising her dedication to finding loving homes for society's most vulnerable children. Mrs. Cross's presentation was everything that Riverside's civic leaders had hoped to find in someone who could address their community's growing orphan population. She spoke eloquently about the latest developments in child psychology and education, demonstrated familiarity with successful orphanage operations throughout the eastern United States, and presented detailed plans for a facility that would serve as a model for progressive child care. Most importantly, she promised that her orphanage would be entirely self-supporting through adoption fees paid by families wealthy enough to afford the comprehensive services she would provide. The Riverside Orphanage that Helena Cross established was impressive by any standard. The main building, constructed of local timber and stone, stood 3 stories tall and contained dormitories, classrooms, dining halls, and administrative offices designed to house up to 50 children comfortably. The grounds included gardens where children could learn agricultural skills, workshops for teaching practical trades, and recreational areas that emphasized the importance of physical fitness and outdoor activity. Every aspect of the facility suggested careful planning by someone who understood both the practical requirements of child care and the educational philosophy that would prepare orphaned children for successful integration into respectable society. Mrs. Cross's approach to adoption was revolutionary for its time, anticipating many of the practices that would later become standard in professional social work. Rather than simply accepting any family willing to pay the required fees, she insisted on extensive interviews, home visits, and character references that would ensure children were placed only with families capable of providing proper care and moral guidance. Her screening process was so thorough that many families waited months or even years before being approved for adoption, a delay that actually enhanced the orphanage's reputation by suggesting that Mrs. Cross would never compromise a child's welfare for financial gain. The families who successfully completed Mrs. Cross's adoption process represented the cream of Pacific Northwest society. The Hendersons, who owned the largest logging operation in the region, adopted a 7-year-old boy named Timothy in 1891, paying the substantial fee of $200 for what they understood would be comprehensive preparation and ongoing support services. The Carlsons, prominent merchants with interests in both timber and shipping, adopted 2 sisters, ages 5 and 8, in 1893, expressing their gratitude for Mrs. Cross's careful attention to ensuring the girls would integrate smoothly into their household. The Morrisons, who had made their fortune in salmon fishing, adopted 3 children over a 4-year period, becoming such enthusiastic advocates for the orphanage that they regularly encouraged their social circle to consider similar adoptions. What made the Riverside Orphanage particularly attractive to wealthy families was Mrs. Cross's promise of complete discretion and ongoing support. Adopted children came with detailed documentation of their backgrounds, health records, and educational progress, allowing adoptive families to integrate them seamlessly into their households without the social complications that sometimes accompanied adoption from less professional facilities. Mrs. Cross also offered to maintain ongoing relationships with adopted children and their new families, providing counseling and support services that would ensure successful adjustments and long-term family stability. The adoption process itself was conducted with ceremony and formality that impressed participating families with its seriousness and professionalism. Children selected for adoption underwent weeks of special preparation, including intensive instruction in household etiquette, religious observance, and social graces appropriate to their new circumstances. They were provided with new clothing, personal items, and carefully selected books that would help them understand their roles and responsibilities as members of respectable families. The actual transfer of custody involved elaborate paperwork, official seals, and ceremonial presentations that gave adoptive families confidence they were participating in a legitimate and legally binding process. Mrs. Cross maintained extensive correspondence with adoptive families, sending regular updates about the orphanage's activities and requesting information about how their adopted children were adjusting to their new circumstances. These letters served multiple purposes. They demonstrated ongoing professional interest in child welfare, provided opportunities for families to make additional donations to support the orphanage's work, and created a network of satisfied customers who would recommend the facility to other prospective adoptive families. The correspondence files that Mrs. Cross maintained became substantial testimonials to the success of her approach and the gratitude of families who had benefited from her services. The financial success of the Riverside Orphanage was remarkable and became a source of pride for the entire community. Mrs. Cross operated the facility without any government subsidies or church support, relying entirely on adoption fees and voluntary donations from grateful families and community supporters. Her annual reports showed steady growth in both the number of children served and the revenue generated, with surplus funds being invested in facility improvements and expanded services. Local newspapers regularly featured stories about the orphanage's achievements, holding it up as an example of how private charity could address social problems more effectively than government programs. The children who lived at the Riverside Orphanage while awaiting adoption appeared to be healthy, well-educated, and remarkably well-behaved. Community members who visited the facility during organized tours consistently commented on the children's polite demeanor, neat appearance, and obvious happiness with their circumstances. Mrs. Cross encouraged these visits as a way of demonstrating transparency in her operations and building community support for her work. The children who participated in these public presentations spoke enthusiastically about their educational activities, expressed appropriate gratitude for the care they received, and seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of finding permanent homes with loving families. The orphanage's educational program was particularly impressive to visitors and adoptive families. Children received instruction not only in basic academic subjects, but also in practical skills that would make them valuable additions to their adoptive households. Girls learned cooking, sewing, household management, and child care, while boys received training in carpentry, agriculture, animal husbandry, and other trades that would ensure they could contribute productively to their new family's economic activities. Mrs. Cross emphasized that adoption should benefit both children and families, creating relationships that were based on mutual advantage rather than simple charity. Religious instruction was a central component of the orphanage's program, with daily chapel services, Bible study, and moral education that emphasized obedience, gratitude, and acceptance of divine providence. Mrs. Cross understood that prospective adoptive families wanted assurance that children had been properly prepared for integration into Christian households, and she made certain that every child could demonstrate familiarity with appropriate prayers, hymns, and biblical passages. This religious preparation was particularly important for families who planned to introduce adopted children into their social circles as full family members, rather than as obvious charity cases. The first indication that something was seriously wrong with the Riverside Orphanage came in 1913, when Margaret Henderson began asking questions about the son her family had adopted 22 years earlier. Timothy Henderson had been 7 years old when he joined the Henderson family in 1891, and by all accounts he had been a model son who integrated seamlessly into their household. He had received excellent education, participated actively in family business activities, and maintained close relationships with his adoptive parents and siblings throughout his childhood and adolescence. But in 1913, when Timothy reached his 29th birthday, he announced his engagement to a young woman whose family had asked routine questions about his background as part of their own evaluation of the proposed marriage. Timothy had always known he was adopted, and the Henderson family had preserved all the documentation they had received from the Riverside Orphanage, including detailed records of his life before adoption and his biological family's circumstances. When Timothy's fiancée's family asked to verify this documentation as part of their investigation into his suitability as a husband, they discovered that none of the information could be corroborated. The birth certificate that Mrs. Cross had provided showed Timothy's birth in a Portland hospital that had no record of his birth. The death certificates for his biological parents referred to individuals who could not be located in any official records. The previous addresses where Timothy had supposedly lived before arriving at the orphanage did not exist, and the relatives who had allegedly made arrangements for his care had never been real people. Every piece of documentation that the Henderson family had received about their adopted son's background appeared to be completely fabricated. Margaret Henderson's initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm. She assumed that Mrs. Cross had simply made clerical errors in preparing Timothy's documentation, or that the records had been damaged or lost over the years since his adoption. Mrs. Henderson contacted the Riverside Orphanage to request corrected documentation, expecting that Mrs. Cross would be able to provide accurate information from her files. Instead, she was informed that Mrs. Cross had died several years earlier and that the orphanage had been closed since 1913. The person who responded to her inquiry claimed to have no knowledge of Timothy's case and suggested that she contact state authorities if she needed official verification of adoption records. Mrs. Henderson's investigation into Timothy's background led her to contact other families who had adopted children from the Riverside Orphanage over the years. What she discovered was that every family she contacted had experienced similar problems when they attempted to verify their adopted children's documentation. Birth certificates, death certificates, family histories, and previous addresses were all fabricated. In every case, The children had appeared at the orphanage with no verifiable history and had been provided with completely fictional backgrounds that could not be corroborated through any official records. The implications of these discoveries were staggering. If the documentation provided by the Riverside Orphanage was fabricated, then the children who had been adopted might not have been legitimate orphans at all. They might have been kidnapped children whose real families had never stopped looking for them, or they might have been children who had been sold to the orphanage by parents who wanted to dispose of unwanted offspring. Most disturbing of all was the possibility that Mrs. Cross had been operating an elaborate fraud that had deceived dozens of families while generating substantial profits through the sale of children whose origins could never be traced. Mrs. Henderson's investigation expanded as she contacted other adoptive families and shared her findings with community leaders who had supported the orphanage during its years of operation. The more they investigated, the more disturbing the picture became. Every aspect of the orphanage's operations that had seemed most impressive and professional was revealed to be an elaborate deception designed to conceal systematic criminal activity. The adoption certificates that families had received were printed on impressive paper with official-looking seals, but they had no legal validity and were not filed with any government agencies. The reference letters that Mrs. Cross had provided came from individuals who either did not exist or who had no knowledge of the children they supposedly recommended. The medical examinations that had documented each child's health had been conducted by a physician whose credentials could not be verified and who appeared to have had no legitimate medical training. Most shocking of all was the revelation that Mrs. Cross herself was not who she had claimed to be. The woman who had operated the Riverside Orphanage under the name Helena Cross had no previous experience in child welfare work, had never operated orphanages in San Francisco or Portland, and had arrived in Riverside with a completely fabricated identity. Her letters of recommendation were forgeries, her educational credentials were false, and her personal history was a carefully constructed fiction designed to gain the trust of the community she intended to deceive. As word of these discoveries spread throughout the Pacific Northwest, dozens of other adoptive families came forward with similar concerns about children they had adopted from the Riverside Orphanage. The scope of the deception became clear. Over 24 years of operation, Mrs. Cross had claimed to place over 200 children with adoptive families, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in adoption fees while providing families with children whose backgrounds could never be verified and whose very identities were questionable. But the most terrifying question remained unanswered. If the children had not actually been adopted by the families who had paid for them, and if the adoption certificates were fraudulent, then what had actually happened to the 200 children who had entered the Riverside Orphanage? The investigation that would follow would uncover truths so horrifying that many involved wished they had never begun asking questions about the fate of children they had tried to save. The investigation into the Riverside Orphanage fraud began as a civil matter involving disappointed adoptive families seeking clarification about documentation irregularities, but it quickly evolved into a criminal investigation that would expose one of the most systematic and profitable child trafficking operations in American history. Oregon State Inspector Daniel Porter, who had been assigned to investigate complaints about the orphanage's record-keeping, found himself uncovering evidence of crimes so extensive and sophisticated that they challenged his understanding of institutional evil. Inspector Porter's first task was to determine the actual number of children who had been involved in the Riverside Orphanage's operations over its 24 years of existence. Mrs. Cross had maintained meticulous records of her activities, but those records proved to be as fraudulent as everything else about her operation. The official ledgers showed 200 children admitted to the facility and 200 children successfully placed with adoptive families, creating the appearance of perfect efficiency and complete success. But when Porter attempted to verify these numbers through independent sources, he discovered that the statistics were entirely fictional. Local authorities had no records of 200 children being processed through the Riverside Orphanage. There were no birth certificates, death certificates, or legal documents that would account for such a large number of children passing through a single facility. More troubling still was Porter's discovery that many of the children who supposedly had been adopted by specific families had never actually existed. The names in Mrs. Cross's ledgers corresponded to fictional individuals whose backgrounds, physical descriptions, and personal histories had been invented entirely for the purpose of creating believable adoption scenarios. Porter's investigation revealed that Mrs. Cross had been operating multiple concurrent frauds that were far more complex than simple adoption scams. She had been receiving money from wealthy families who believed they were adopting children, but she had also been receiving money from other sources for entirely different purposes. Some payments came from families who wanted unwanted children to disappear permanently. Others came from individuals who were purchasing children for purposes that had nothing to do with adoption, and still others came from criminal networks that were using the orphanage as a front for various illegal activities. The inspector's examination of Mrs. Cross's financial records revealed income streams that could not be explained through legitimate adoption fees. Over 24 years, she had received over $150,000 in payments, an enormous sum that exceeded what any orphanage could generate through conventional operations. The money had come from sources throughout the western United States, suggesting that Mrs. Cross had been operating a network that extended far beyond the local community where her orphanage was located. Porter's investigation was complicated by the fact that Mrs. Cross had disappeared shortly before the orphanage closed in 1913, taking with her most of the detailed records that would have explained her operations. The few documents that remained at the facility were carefully edited to remove information that might have implicated specific individuals or revealed the true nature of the activities that had taken place there. It appeared that Mrs. Cross had planned her exit strategy carefully, ensuring that evidence of her crimes would be minimal and that investigating authorities would face substantial obstacles in determining what had actually occurred. The breakthrough in Porter's investigation came when he located Sarah Mitchell, a former employee of the orphanage who had worked there from 1905 to 1910 as an assistant to Mrs. Cross. Mitchell had left the facility abruptly and had moved to California, where she had remained silent about her experiences at the orphanage for over a decade. When Porter finally tracked her down and explained the purpose of his investigation, Mitchell agreed to provide testimony that would expose the true nature of the Riverside Orphanage's operations. According to Mitchell's account, the orphanage had never been a legitimate child welfare facility. Instead, it had served as a processing center for what Mrs. Cross called her inventory management system, a sophisticated operation that acquired children from various sources and then disposed of them through different channels depending on market demand and customer requirements. Some children were placed with families who genuinely believed they were participating in legal adoptions, but these legitimate placements represented only a small fraction of the children who passed through the facility. Mitchell described 3 distinct categories of children who had been processed through the orphanage. The first group consisted of children who had been kidnapped from their families or lured away from their homes through deception. These children were typically healthy, attractive, and young enough to be trained for specific purposes. They commanded the highest prices and were usually sold to customers who had particular requirements for age, appearance, or other characteristics. The second group consisted of children who had been sold to Mrs. Cross by their own families. These were typically children from poor families who could not afford to care for them, or children whose parents wanted to dispose of them for various reasons. These children were usually older and less healthy than the kidnapped children, and they were sold to customers who were less discriminating about the specific characteristics of the children they purchased. The third group consisted of children who had been acquired from other criminal operations, or who had been born to women who were being held at various facilities that Mrs. Cross operated, in addition to the main orphanage building. These children had no legal existence and no families who would search for them if they disappeared. They were used for the most dangerous and experimental purposes, serving as subjects for activities that Mrs. Cross's customers could not risk conducting on children who might be missed if something went wrong. Mitchell's testimony revealed that the elaborate adoption ceremonies and professional documentation that had impressed legitimate adoptive families were actually carefully designed theater intended to provide plausible cover for Mrs. Cross's criminal activities. The families who participated in these ceremonies were unknowing accomplices who provided respectability and community support for operations that were entirely criminal in nature. The inspector's investigation revealed that Mrs. Cross had been receiving children from a network of suppliers throughout the western United States and Canada. Some suppliers were criminal organizations that specialized in kidnapping children for sale to facilities like the Riverside Orphanage. Others were corrupt officials at legitimate orphanages and foster care facilities who were paid to redirect children away from proper placement processes. Still others were individuals who served as intermediaries between families who wanted to sell unwanted children and facilities that were willing to purchase them. Porter's investigation also uncovered evidence that Mrs. Cross had been selling children to customers throughout North America for purposes that extended far beyond conventional adoption. Some children were sold to wealthy families who wanted servants who would be completely dependent and controllable. Others were sold to individuals who operated various forms of illegal enterprises that required child labor. Still others were sold to customers whose purposes were so disturbing that Mitchell refused to provide detailed testimony about what she had observed. The inspector discovered that Mrs. Cross had maintained careful records of her customers and their specific requirements, creating a sophisticated database that allowed her to match available children with customer demands efficiently. These records included detailed information about customer preferences, payment capabilities, and previous purchase history. The operation was conducted with the same attention to customer service and market efficiency that characterized legitimate businesses, except that the product being sold was human children. Porter's investigation revealed that the Riverside Orphanage had been just one component of a much larger criminal network that Mrs. Cross had established throughout the Pacific Northwest. She had operated similar facilities in Washington, California, and British Columbia, all using variations of the same methods that had proven successful in Oregon. The network had processed over 1,000 children during its years of operation, generating profits that had made Mrs. Cross one of the wealthiest individuals in the region. The inspector's findings demonstrated that Mrs. Cross had achieved her success through a combination of sophisticated criminal techniques and careful exploitation of social attitudes that made her activities possible. She had recognized that wealthy families wanted to adopt children but were unwilling to deal with the bureaucratic complications and legal uncertainties that characterized legitimate adoption processes. By providing them with streamlined professional services that eliminated these complications, she had created a customer base that was grateful for her services and protective of her reputation. Mrs. Cross had also recognized that society's most vulnerable children could be acquired and disposed of without significant risk of legal consequences. Children from poor families, immigrant communities, and unstable households could disappear without generating the kind of public concern that would threaten her operations. By focusing on these populations, she had ensured that her criminal activities would attract minimal attention from law enforcement authorities. The investigation revealed that Mrs. Cross had been protected by a network of corrupt officials and community leaders who had benefited from her activities either through direct payments or through the political and social advantages that came from supporting what appeared to be a successful charitable institution. Local politicians had praised her work, religious leaders had endorsed her mission, and business leaders had provided financial support for what they believed was an exemplary example of private charity addressing social problems. Porter's investigation was hampered by the fact that many of the individuals who had been involved in Mrs. Cross's network had died, disappeared, or were unwilling to provide testimony that would incriminate themselves or reveal their knowledge of criminal activities. The families who had genuinely believed they were adopting children were reluctant to cooperate with an investigation that might reveal that their beloved family members had been acquired through criminal means. The officials who had provided protection for Mrs. Cross's operations were determined to prevent exposure that would destroy their careers and reputations. As Porter compiled his findings, he began to understand that the Riverside Orphanage case represented something far larger than individual criminal activity. Mrs. Cross had demonstrated that systematic child trafficking could be disguised as charitable work, that wealthy and respectable families could be converted into unknowing accomplices in criminal enterprises, and that entire communities could be deceived into supporting operations that were fundamentally evil in nature. The investigation had revealed the existence of a sophisticated criminal network that had operated for over 2 decades without detection, processing hundreds of children and generating enormous profits for its operators. But the most disturbing aspect of Porter's findings was his realization that similar networks were likely operating throughout the country, protected by the same combination of social respectability, community support, and official corruption that had enabled Mrs. Cross's success. The inspector's final report would document crimes involving over 1,000 children and criminal profits exceeding $500,000, but it would also raise questions about the adequacy of legal and social systems that had failed to protect society's most vulnerable members. The Riverside Orphanage case would become a landmark in the development of child protection laws and adoption oversight, but it would also serve as a permanent reminder of how easily systematic evil could flourish when it was disguised as charitable work and protected by community respectability. Inspector Porter's investigation into the Riverside Orphanage should have resulted in the largest child trafficking prosecution in American history. The evidence he had compiled was overwhelming: detailed testimony from former employees, financial records documenting systematic fraud, correspondence proving the existence of an international criminal network, and physical evidence of crimes involving over 1,000 children. But when Porter submitted his final report to the Oregon Attorney General's office in early 1914, he discovered that the pursuit of justice would be subordinated to the protection of institutional interests that were far more powerful than individual human rights. Attorney General Robert Caldwell's initial response to Porter's report was one of professional shock and determination to prosecute all individuals involved in the child trafficking network to the fullest extent of the law. Caldwell had built his political career on a reputation for protecting the innocent and holding corrupt officials accountable for their crimes. The systematic abuse of children documented in Porter's investigation represented exactly the kind of clear moral issue that would enhance his standing with voters while serving the cause of justice. But Caldwell's resolve began to weaken as the political and social implications of prosecution became clear. Within days of receiving Porter's report, Caldwell found himself facing pressure from some of Oregon's most influential families and institutions. The investigation had implicated dozens of prominent citizens who had unknowingly participated in Mrs. Cross's criminal network, either as customers who had purchased trafficked children or as supporters who had provided funding and protection for her operations. The families who had adopted children through the Riverside Orphanage faced the devastating possibility that their beloved family members had been acquired through kidnapping, fraud, or other criminal means. These families included some of the most respected names in Pacific Northwest society: successful merchants, prominent professionals, religious leaders, and political figures who had built their reputations on moral leadership and community service. The exposure of their involvement in child trafficking, even if unknowing, would destroy not only their personal reputations, but also the social and economic institutions they represented. The pressure applied to Attorney General Caldwell went far beyond political persuasion. His law practice received threats that major corporate clients would terminate their relationships if he proceeded with prosecution that would expose their involvement in the orphanage scandal. His wife was informed that her position on the boards of several charitable organizations would be terminated if the investigation continued. Most significantly, Caldwell was told that his own political future would be destroyed if he pursued charges that would implicate prominent Oregon families in systematic criminal activity. The campaign to suppress the Riverside investigation was coordinated by a consortium of interests that included the families who had adopted children through Mrs. Cross's network, business leaders who had provided financial support for the orphanage, and political figures who had endorsed her work. This consortium possessed sufficient resources and influence to ensure that prosecution would be prevented regardless of the strength of the evidence or the severity of the crimes involved. The children who had been trafficked through the Riverside Orphanage and its associated facilities were never acknowledged as victims, never provided with assistance in recovering their identities or reconnecting with their biological families, and never offered compensation for the abuse they had suffered. Many had been so young when they were trafficked that they had no memory of their lives before entering Mrs. Cross's system, leaving them without knowledge of their true identities or family backgrounds. The adoptive families who had unknowingly purchased trafficked children faced impossible choices about how to respond to the revelation that their family relationships were based on criminal activity. Some chose to maintain silence about their adoption experiences, protecting their family unity at the cost of preventing justice for trafficking victims. Others attempted to investigate their children's backgrounds independently, hoping to identify their biological families or provide some form of restitution for the crimes from which they had unknowingly benefited. The modern implications of the Riverside Orphanage case extend far beyond historical curiosity about early 20th century adoption practices. The techniques developed by Mrs. Cross for identifying vulnerable children, deceiving prospective customers, and avoiding official detection have been studied and adapted by criminal organizations throughout the world. The combination of legitimate-appearing charitable work and sophisticated customer service that characterized her operations continues to be used by human trafficking networks that recognize the effectiveness of her methods. The institutional mechanisms that enabled the Riverside network to operate undetected for over 2 decades continue to exist in contemporary child welfare systems. The same combination of community respectability, official endorsement, and customer satisfaction that protected Mrs. Cross's crimes can still be found in modern institutions that prioritize organizational survival above child protection. The culture of institutional loyalty that prevented exposure of the orphanage's activities remains a powerful force that protects systematic abuse from public scrutiny. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the Riverside case was not unique, but representative of a broader pattern of systematic child exploitation that has characterized American social institutions throughout their development. The techniques pioneered by Mrs. Cross were not aberrations, but logical extensions of social attitudes that viewed children as commodities to be managed according to adult convenience, rather than as individuals deserving of protection and dignity. The cover-up that protected the Riverside investigation from public exposure demonstrated how institutional power could overcome individual conscience when sufficient resources and influence were applied to suppress inconvenient truths. The consortium that prevented prosecution of Mrs. Cross's network established a model for subsequent cover-ups that would be employed whenever child protection conflicted with institutional interests. The precedent set in Oregon would be cited and emulated in later cases where powerful interests sought to prevent accountability for systematic abuse. The legacy of the Riverside Orphanage extends beyond its direct victims to encompass all children whose protection depends on institutions that prioritize their own survival above moral responsibility. The 1,000 children who were trafficked through Mrs. Cross's network became symbols of society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members when that protection conflicted with the interests of powerful institutions and respected community leaders. The statistical impossibility that had first attracted Inspector Porter's attention, 200 children who had supposedly been adopted but who had actually disappeared, became a permanent reminder of how easily systematic abuse could be concealed when it was disguised as charitable work and protected by community respectability. The children who had entered the Riverside Orphanage seeking safety and family had instead become casualties of a criminal network that exploited society's noblest impulses to facilitate its most evil purposes. In the end, the Riverside Orphanage case demonstrated that the most horrific crimes against children could be committed in plain sight when they were conducted by individuals with sufficient social status and institutional protection. The systematic trafficking of over 1,000 children was enabled not by secrecy and concealment, but by respectability and community support that made questioning the operation seem unthinkable until it was too late to achieve justice for the victims whose lives had been destroyed by adult greed and institutional indifference.